Well, Eddie, over the last 3 days, I've counted 8 national polls that have been published. 4 show a slight increase in the Conservative lead, 3 show a slight reduction, and 1 shows no change. Now, that's exactly what you predict if you knew that nothing had changed. You get this sampling wobble both ways. So, bottom line, over the last 10 days, nothing much has changed.
Which means, does it, that the Conservatives are on course for a majority of some kind?
Yes, if the polls are roughly right, it seems to me everything's pretty becalmed, and unless this health story today or something else happens in the next 48 hours, we're possibly looking at a comfortable Conservative majority. But remember, in 2015, if you took an average of the polls, they underestimated the Conservative lead by 6 percentage points. Last time, 2017, the average at the end overestimated the Conservative lead by 5 percentage points. So if the polls are out by the same margin either way, we could be looking at a hung parliament, or we could be looking at a Conservative landslide.
Do we know? Goodness gracious! Do we know if people are making up their minds yet? Those undecided voters.
Every election that I've watched, and God knows how many I've watched over the decades, there's a story about now saying, well, there are a lot of undecideds, and if they swing one way, that could completely change the election. Well, with one exception I'll come to in a minute, it never happens like that. They're roughly the same number of undecideds, around 12 to 15% as usual at this time. And what experience tells us is that the undecideds generally either don't vote or they're divided in the same way as everybody else. Here's the exception. The one group that seems to be more undecided than any other are people who voted Labour last time and Leave in the 2016 referendum. They're, if you like, conflicted between their loyalty, perhaps historic loyalty to the Labour Party, and their support for Brexit. So it could be, if they en masse go one way or the other, that could have an effect in maybe some of those famous Labour seats in the Midlands and North, where you get a lot of these Labour Leave voters.
And worth emphasising that while the Conservative lead over Labour hasn't, broadly speaking, changed much, there has been plenty change during the campaign for some of the other parties. It hasn't been that the campaign, everyone's fought to a dead heat.
But that's right. If you take sort of September, October, there was a huge shift, because in early September you had, Labour, Conservatives, Liberal Democrats, Brexit Party, all somewhere around the early 20s, early to mid 20s, and it's sort of shaken out, and you've got this reversion to the big parties, Labour and Conservative. Both have gained ground over the last few weeks. But we end up roughly where we were when the election was called at the end of October. Then the Conservatives had around a 10 or 11% lead on average. Today they have around a 10 or 11% lead. Now, the one thing that I think give Conservatives cheer, despite the inevitable uncertainties around polls, is what we do know is that Boris Johnson is far more popular, or perhaps I should say far less unpopular, than Jeremy Corbyn, and the Conservatives are far more trusted on the economy than Labour. And historically, if you've got one party clearly ahead on leadership and clearly ahead on the economy, then it's heading to win the election. Whether this will be the exception, I doubt, but it's not inconceivable.
You've kindly been with us every Monday since the election began, Peter, and you've even more kindly agreed to come back on Wednesday. We expect a whole slew of polls to be published on Wednesday morning. How important are they? Or I suppose the better question is, how historically accurate have they been at forecasting what actually happens in the election?
Well, as I said earlier, Eddie, in the last 2 elections, they weren't accurate. I mean, 1 or 2 exceptions in each case, but in general, they were quite a long way out the last 2 elections. But over decades, the polls get it broadly right far more often than they get it wrong. And even when they get it wrong, as they did last time, they still told some important stories about what was going on with the rise of Jeremy Corbyn during the campaign, the collapse in Theresa May's standing during the course of the campaign, the closing of the gap. They didn't get the figure at the end quite right, but you got that clearly happening. And one of the things that's odd this time, or at least different this time, is that over the last few weeks, since the campaign really got going, end of October, beginning of November, a lot of changes in September, October, but not much since then.